Hello everyone. Today I am going to teach you about the posterior communicating artery aneurysm. So what is the posterior communicating artery? So we need to first know the location of the posterior communicating artery. This is the diagram about the circle of Willis. Here we have the vertebral artery and which joins together to form the basilar artery. The basilar artery will in turn form the posterior communicating artery. Here we have the internal carotid artery which forms the middle cerebral artery, which forms the superior and the inferior branches of the middle cerebral artery. This is the anterior cerebral artery and this is the anterior communicating artery. Now the posterior cerebral artery and the internal carotid artery are anastomosed by the posterior communicating artery. Any aneurysm of the posterior communicating artery, will affect which nerve? It will affect the third cranial nerve. Why? This circle of Willis is present exactly in the base of the brain. So if this is the brain, then the base of the brain is where the circle of Willis supplies blood to the base of the brain, and then we have the midbrain, pons as well as the medulla. So which cranial nerve arises from where? You should know that the midbrain has third and the fourth cranial nerve. Pons, it is a larger cranial nerve which will be present in all the three. So let's leave out of the subject right now. 6, 7 and 8 from the pons, and medulla will be from 9, 10, 11 and 12. So the third cranial nerve, that is which arises from the midbrain, will arise through the interpeduncular fossa. Where exactly is the interpeduncular fossa? Just pertaining to the topic, if you want to know, it is that space between the base of the brain as well as the midbrain. So that area is the interpeduncular fossa. Only in that area we have this circle of Willis supplying the base of the brain, and similarly that area, that is the base of the brain and the base of the brain as well as the midbrain, we have our third cranial nerve coming out. So therefore that area is the interpeduncular fossa. So when there is an aneurysm of the posterior communicating artery, then it affects the third cranial nerve. So this is about the location. Now in third cranial nerve, what is the use of the third cranial nerve? Third cranial nerve has two important features, two distinct features. One is it has a deeper nerve fibers and a superficial nerve fibers. The superficial nerve fibers are the ones that are responsible for pupillary constriction. What do you know about pupillary constriction? When a light is shone in the eye, then that intensity of the light is gauged by the second cranial nerve, that is the afferent impulse is taken by the second cranial nerve, and the efferent, that is this much of pupil should be constricted, or pupil need not be constricted, or pupil need to be dilated. All those impulses are sent from the brain through the third cranial nerve. Fine. So pupillary constriction is caused by the third cranial nerve, and in addition to it, the ciliary muscles are also supplied by the third cranial nerve. What is the use of ciliary muscle? Accommodation is the key for ciliary muscle. So which part of the third cranial nerve supplies the pupil as well as the ciliary muscles? It is the inner superficial fibers will supply this, but the deeper fibers, the deeper nerve fibers are the one which is responsible for extraocular movements. All extraocular movements, that is turning to all directions, are caused by extraocular muscles which are supplied by the third cranial nerve, except two movements, that is the lateral rectus is supplied by the sixth cranial nerve, which is commonly by the mnemonic lateral rectus LR and LR6, and the superior oblique is also supplied by the fourth cranial nerve SO4. I have a separate video on extraocular muscles, you can check that out. Now other than those two muscles, all the other muscles are supplied by the extraocular muscles, and the levator palpebrae superioris, that is the eyelid muscle, is also supplied by the third cranial nerve. Now when there is an aneurysm in the posterior communicating artery, the third cranial nerve is the one affected. Which part of the third cranial nerve will be affected? Whether the superficial or the deep part will be affected? The superficial part will be affected, obviously, right? An aneurysm will be touching the superficial part of the third cranial nerve, right? That superficial part is the one which is responsible for pupillary constriction as well as ciliary accommodation. So when there is aneurysm and the third cranial nerve is affected, then the pupillary constriction will not happen. So we will be having a blown out pupil, that is a dilated pupil will be there, and in addition to it there will be loss of accommodation. but in conditions where the deep fibers are affected. When are the deep fibers affected? Systemic diseases like diabetes mellitus will affect the deeper fibers. In such a case, external ocular muscles as well as levator palpebrae superioris will be affected. So, they will be presenting with impairment of the eye movements and ptosis. So, that is what happens when the deep fibers are affected, but as of now posterior communicating artery aneurysm will be affecting the superficial fibers, thereby resulting in a loss of accommodation as well as pupillary constriction, which is commonly referred as blown out pupil and loss of accommodation. I hope I have made this clear. Thank you for listening all this while.